Well, our speaker today is Dr. Manfred Brauch, a retired Christian educator. Dr. Brauch is a renowned scholar in biblical theology and New Testament interpretation. He's a graduate of Sioux Falls Seminary, where he has a Master of Divinity, Princeton Theological Seminary, where he has a Master's in Theology, and McMaster University in Canada, where he obtained his PhD. From 70 to 78, he taught New Testament interpretation at Northern Baptist Theological Seminary in Overbrook, Illinois. He was then called to Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, now Wallingford Theological Seminary from Eastern University in St. David's, where he oversaw the course for 26 years. He served in many positions, including academic dean, professor of biblical theology, and president. He's the author of numerous essays and books in academic Christian journals, as well as actually books themselves. Set Free to Be, a study in Romans, Hard Sayings of Paul, Abusing Scripture, the consequences of misreading the Bible, which I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about. In 2004, Dr. Brauch retired from Eastern, and together with his wife, Martine, a physician at family medicine, who was born to eternal life in 2014, engaged for a decade in volunteer work in theological, biblical education, and medical mission in Thailand, Chile, New Zealand, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Cameroon in West Africa. He continues to be active in adult faith formation education programs in local churches. Let's welcome Dr. Brauch.
Introductions like that make me look nervous. Because you can never live up to what is said about you. That reminds me of a story. When my son was I think he was in first grade, here in Wayne. And at a teacher's conference, his teacher told me a story. He said, I asked your son one time, what does your daddy do? And your son paused for a moment, and then he said, my daddy is a doctor, but not the kind who does anybody any good. Out of the mouth of babes, you have to hear the truth, right? Yeah. Well, it's good to be with you. Wallingford, Presbyterian Church. The topic, Christian nationalism, that reminds me of handouts. Two of them, we'll get them started on this side, and we'll get this one started on this side.
There are two different ones.
The handouts include bibliographies, resources, commentary, notes, all kinds of things. I will be pointing to some of them as we go along this morning, especially. Some of it is for your own, possibly continuing study and reading on the topic. It's interesting, as I've reviewed the bibliography again, that has informed me a lot about the topic. That virtually the entire body of books and articles that have been written in the last 12 years. The last 12 years. That's how important this topic has become. And it has been commented on and explored from both, very left-leaning Christianity to very right-wing Christianity. I'll talk a little about that as we go along. Okay, I will be pointing at, so you don't need to go through that right now, but I will be pointing to some of those a few times during my presentation this morning. The danger and heresy, those two words. you know what heresy is, don't you? Something that's heretical in a faith tradition that challenges the central core tradition of the faith. And if something is heretical, like some of the early Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament, they were spouting ideas that did not conform to the apostolic witness. And so there is this concept of false teaching. Somebody has said that there's nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. That's one of the things that I'm particularly focusing on in the last session, on the biblical perspective on Christian nationalism. I will try to show that much of that has to do with misinterpreting and taking scriptural texts out of context and supporting a particular understanding of what Christianity is supposed to be and to do in the context of a particular culture or nation. Okay. I want to say something about those two words, danger and heretical. Christian nationalism and the concept of white supremacy are close cousins. They're closely aligned. They often walk hand in hand. And the ideology of Christian nationalism has negative, distortive, and destructive consequences for both the nation, for the kind of democracy that we are, the kind of history that we share, both the nation and the church. So those are two central principles that I want to emphasize as we go along. The outline of this free Sunday series on Christian nationalism today, February 22nd, is kind of an introductory overview, dealing with terms and concepts and so on, definitions and problems. What is nationalism? What is patriotism? Because often patriotism and nationalism are confused. If you're not a Christian nationalist, you're not patriotic. I've heard that again and again and again. It's just false. It's not true. What is nationalism? What is patriotism? What is the problem with nationalism? What is Christian nationalism? And an underlying question is, was the U.S. founded as a Christian nation? Which is the subtext of the ideology of Christian nationalism. Okay? So, next week we are going to look at the historical background. That is Christian nationalism, though it wasn't called that over all those centuries, Christian nationalism across the centuries and its tragic consequences. This is not something new. It takes on different shapes and forms, as a different kind of language and so on and so forth, images. But the concept of the wedding of church and state, as it were, that is at the heart of Christian nationalism, goes all the way back from the Roman Emperor Theodosius, who declared the church in 380 BC, declared the church to be the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Now, about 40 years earlier, Constantine legalized Christianity, because until that point there was systemic persecution of Christians throughout the Roman Empire. Constantine in 332, somewhere in there, declared the legality of Christianity. And Theodosius, 40 years later, declared Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. And that's when we started building cathedrals and churches. The interesting thing is that Christianity was the only religion in the ancient world that didn't have temples and shrines. That's an interesting fact. But once Christianity was recognized by the state, it was now able to, in a sense, emulate all the other previous religions that were present in the Greco-Roman Empire. Okay. And this, in this historical background, I'm going to trace that from the 4th century all the way to the present, in different parts of basically the Western world. And then the third session on March the 8th, Christian nationalism in biblical perspective. That's obviously the place where my heart is. Because one of the things that troubles me the most about the ideology of Christian nationalism is how many in American Protestantism have capitulated to the ideology. Christian nationalism in biblical perspective. If Scripture is our basic resource for the content of our faith, and there are different ways of understanding Scripture and interpreting it and seeing it in terms of authority and so on. For me, what is the most important thing is that the central teaching of the prophets, and especially the life and ministry and teaching of Jesus, have to shape the core of our understanding of the totality of the Christian faith. And so, Christian nationalism in biblical perspective, what I'm going to try to do, just tough to do in one session, an exploration of what I call the abusive and selective use of biblical texts, with special emphasis on the prophetic witness of the Old Testament and the life and teaching of Jesus, where uses of power, Christian nationalism has to do with having your hand at the lever of power. Special emphasis on teaching of Jesus, where the uses of power to control, to restrict, to demean, to exclude, to manipulate, are decidedly rejected as contrary to the purposes of God for human life in community. Okay? So those are the 3 parts of what I'm going to try to share with you. A few introductory images when I talk about misusing Scripture. A bunch of years ago I wrote this book called Abusing Scripture, and because you can't really read that little thing, the subheading is called The Consequences of Misreading the Bible. And for me, that became a central core in my attempt to understand what was happening in Christian nationalism and how that was, in fact, contrary to the central core teachings of the Christian faith as we find it in Scripture. The consequences of misreading the Bible. I love that. I have this line. I can do all things through a verse taken out of context. Now, in some ways, we all are tempted to do that occasionally. But when it becomes the foundation of a heresy, when it becomes the foundation of a danger to not only the Christian church, but to the country in which we live, that becomes something else. Okay? I can do all things through a verse taken out of context. A few more images. Here's a book by Andrew Whitehead, and he's in the bibliography someplace. And the subtitle of that book is How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. You see the imagery there. The serpent. There are places in the Old Testament where the serpent is a symbol of health and healing. And we still have the caduceus on ambulances. Comes out of that ancient idea of the serpent, as it puts in Genesis, the wisest, the symbol of wisdom in Egyptian religiosity and throughout the ancient Near East. So the serpent has that dimension, but it's also clearly the image throughout Christian history of that which is evil. He's got the cross in his fangs. Okay. The idolatry. How Christian nationalism betrays the gospel and threatens the church. American heresy, there's the word. Unfortunately, I discovered that word before I read the book. But it doesn't matter. American heresy, the roots and reach of white Christian nationalism. Christian Ethics Today is a journal that I regularly read, a journal of Christian ethics, and in that, in the fall 2022 volume, there's an essay by Paul Baston, who's a senior pastor at the community church in Texas, Baylor University graduate, etc., etc. Wonderful writer and powerful pastor. Journal of Christian Ethics, The Dangers of Christian Nationalism. There are a few comments about his book in the notes in the bibliography that I've passed out. In Christianity Today, and Christianity Today has been historically the major voice of what has been called the evangelical branch of American Christianity. But they're thinking people, and they know where we are going and what is happening. And in that article, What is Christian Nationalism? Paul Miller having written the book, The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism, InterVarsity Press, which is the press that published my book. What is Christian nationalism? And he has a powerful way of getting into the nitty-gritty of that ideology. I don't know how many of you know the name John Machen. He's one of my favorite writers. He's a fantastic American historian, American presidential historian. He is the canon of the Catholic Church in New York City. He's a Catholic Christian. And in his book, The Founding Fathers and the Making of a Nation, American gospel simply means what is good news for America. That's what the book is about. And God, the Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation. In this big bibliography that you have in front of you, there is on page 2, at the bottom of the page, highlights about John Machen's American Gospel. You see that on page 2 of the, not the addendum, but a brief bibliography of Christian nationalism. Okay? And at the bottom there, it's a good, I try to summarize the essence of the book. John Machen tells the human story of how the Founding Fathers viewed faith and how they ultimately created a nation in which belief in God is a matter of choice. The good news gospel about America is that religion is free to influence our public life without controlling it. Secularists point to a wall of separation between church and state. That phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, is not in the Constitution. It was formulated by Roger Williams, who was in Rhode Island and wanted to absolutely separate church and state. And the phrase comes from him, a wall of separation. While many conservatives secularists point to a wall of separation between church and state, while many conservatives act as though the founding fathers were apostles in knee breeches. That's like Haslam's phrase. Neither extreme has it right. Okay? Neither extreme has it right. While protecting private religion, both in home and church, from government interference or control. That they believe in the God who invests all human beings with inalienable rights. That was this phrase from the Constitution. So, and what Nation tries to do in that book is to see how important religious ideas and faith and so on have been in American life, but they have been, Christian faith has influenced the way the country has gone, but it has not been co-opted or it has not controlled. Those are different kinds of things, okay? Okay, overview, definitions, and problems. What is the difference between patriotism and nationalism? Let's get that one out of the way. Patriotism is love of country, being committed. I came as a 13-year-old from Germany with family when we immigrated in the after-war years. And I grew up as a teenager in America. I was 13 years old. You may wonder why I'm still speaking with a German accent. Right?
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, well, here's a story. When I was in seminary, we had to record our sermons in the preaching class. I couldn't believe it when I listened to myself preach, how my German accent came through. And I tried everything. I did speech therapy, I listened to my tapes, I did everything, and I just couldn't do it. Somehow it didn't work. And my New Testament professor, who at that point already knew, this was my second year in seminary, already knew that I was pretty clear that I was being called into teaching and scholarship and writing rather than into pastoral ministry. Called me into his office once, and he said, "Manfred, I know you're very worried about your accent, but let me tell you something. In biblical scholarship, you have a German accent, it's an asset, not a liability." So I quit trying. And you have to put up with it. Okay. Patriotism, love of country, while nationalism is about how we define one's country, the character of the country, what it consists of. Patriotism is good, so says one of the authors, because all of God's creation is good. God said it was good. And patriotism helps us be grateful for our particular place in it. Our affection and loyalty as patriots helps us, I think, and that's a new term in our time, helps us to do the good work of creation care. The thing that we are called not to dominate, but to exercise sovereign responsibility over what we have been given in creation. And so creation care is important, as well as advocating for and working to improve our country's foundational values: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, i.e. the common good. All are created equal. It's interesting, I think, that that our Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, has often been understood and interpreted as individualistic. Rugged individualism. John Wayne Christianity. Right? I can do it. I'm my own person. It's interesting that in the Canadian foundational constitutional document, the emphasis is more on the welfare, the well-being of the community rather than the individual. It's interesting direction in which we went. Okay. Our affection and loyalty as patriots helps us to do the good work of creation, as well as advocating for and working to improve our foundational values: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I interpret that as the common good, because we're connected. My personal happiness doesn't stand on its own. It's connected relationally with community, with friends, with loved ones, the nation. All are created equal. Okay, so the difference between patriotism and nationalism. That's patriotism. Nationalism, on the other hand, is based on the belief that humanity is divisible into mutually distinct and internally coherent cultural groups defined by shared traits like language, religion, ethnicity, or culture. Nationalists believe that each of these groups should have their own governments, that governments should promote and protect a nation's cultural identity, and that insofar as these groups have a particular religious identity, Muslim, Hindu, African tribal religions, etc., these groups have the religious identity. That religious identity and tradition should be favored, protected, and privileged. Okay? So you put the 10 Commandments into every classroom. That's a Judeo-Christian document about ethics and value and morality. Good stuff, of course. But is it right in a pluralistic society as America has clearly become and has been from the very beginning to isolate certain kinds of teachings, of ideas, of ideology into the common vocabulary of an educational system which prepares young people for life in a pluralistic society. So what is the problem with this idea of nationalism? And we'll talk about what happened in Germany during the Nazi era. National Socialist, Nazi, really comes from the word Nationalsozialistische Partei, National Socialist Political Party. National Socialism. The attempt, and we'll talk about that later next week, the attempt to create a particular kind of society in Germany with particular touch points that eliminated a lot of other people. It's exclusive. The problem with nationalism: human beings are not easily divisible into mutually distinct cultural units. That is, human migration from one territory of a particular tribe or peoples into the territory of other tribes, like the Israelites migrating into Egypt. Tribal movements have been going on ever since the beginning of the human race. Cultures overlap and thus make a poor fit as the foundation of political order. That is, if we take one particular aspect of our American culture and it becomes the template for the political order, a lot of people get left out. And they're not excluded, they're excluded. Cultures overlap. Number 3, attempting to found, and that's a quotation, attempting to found political legitimacy on cultural likeness means political order will constantly be in danger of being felt as illegitimate by some group or another. Cultural pluralism is essentially inevitable in every nation. Now, there always have been forces to try to undermine that. Nationalist governments tend to become authoritarian and oppressive in practice. For example, in the 1930s, Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy. And in our own day, the attempt to recreate Turkey into the image of an Islamic state by the present dictator of the country. Or even in India, Nehru seeking to make India into a Hindu state, which has all kinds of implications for Buddhists, for Christians. Recently, I was in a seminar with a former missionary to India, and continues to be connected to missionaries in India. There's a lot of pressure against Christian work in India, because under the leadership of this government, trying to reshape India into a monolithic kind of cultural identity with Hinduism as the controlling religious entity. Number 3, attempting to found political legitimacy on cultural likeness means political order will constantly be in danger of being felt as illegitimate by some group or other. Cultural pluralism is essentially inevitable in every nation, and has been in our country ever since the beginning. Nationalist governments, and I was already there, I guess, on that one. Christian nationalism in the United States. The belief that we are a nation defined by Christianity, that's part of the ideology. That national and state laws should privilege that heritage, that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. It is a cultural and religious framework that idealizes and advocates for fusion of a particular expression of Christianity with American civic life and political life. People of other religious and cultural identities are seen as a threat to this Christian identity. It's interesting that an influential advocate of this idea is the late Samuel Huntington scholar, Harvard scholar, in his book *The Clash of Civilizations*, written in 1993. He argued that America is defined by its Anglo-Protestant past, and that we will lose that identity if we do not preserve our cultural inheritance. Inheritance. Which is interesting, because if our common heritage is Anglo-Protestant past, what about Catholics in our country? There was even that fear. Remember when some of you like me are old enough, when John Kennedy was running for the presidency, he was a committed Catholic believer. There was this idea that, he might be listening to the Pope instead of the people. There was this fear that that a different kind of identity, even within the larger tent of Christian doctrine and Christian belief and Christian history, that even some of those needed to be, in a sense, excluded or shoved to the side. Let me, see if I can find it, in one of the handouts. Oh yeah, I want to get that in here. The handout that's entitled Addendum 2, okay? Addendum 2, bibliography. Turn to page 3 at the bottom. And here are some, a few lines, quotes that fit right now. Expert from Paul Baston's essay, The Dangers of Christian Nationalism and Christian Ethics. He talks about our country is, in a sense, guided, as it were, by two national stories that are competing for supremacy in our cultural conflicts. Each one is about the country we love. Each one claims to correspond to the facts of history. Story 1. America is and always has been a Christian nation. That's the ideology of Christian nationalism. The founding fathers were devoted Christians who built a biblical foundation for the nation's future. Hogwash. Some were, okay? Story 2. America isn't, no, I only read that one. Those lines, bullets below, God uniquely favors America above all nations and has blessed her because she is the chosen nation to Christianize the world. We sure did a good job when they persecuted the Native Americans, didn't we? In the early centuries of this nation. Government's role is to pass laws that privilege and empower Christians in churches so they can legislate and enforce godly behavior. The church's purpose is to return America to its Christian roots, which will in turn restore God's plan to bless the world through America. Yeah. Story 2. America is and always has been a religiously neutral nation. Goes on the back page. The founding fathers, religiously speaking, were a mixed bag. They did not uniformly envision a nation where Christianity was the favored religion. Among the founders were some sincere Christians, such as Patrick Henry, John Jay, Samuel Adams, some anti-supernaturalist deists like Thomas Paine and Ethan Allen, and some quasi-deists, almost, quasi-deists who were favorable to, but not committed to, the Judeo-Christian tradition. This last group includes the most famous founding fathers, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Jefferson didn't like a lot of things in the Bible, and he created his own Bible. Wherever were things that he couldn't believe in, like miracles, all of those things, he tore them out. The Jefferson Bible eliminates all the beyond human possibilities aspects of Scripture. Very interesting. One of our founding fathers was a great early president, but he didn't have it all together. Like one author says that some people make it sound like the founding fathers were, in I wrote it down here somewhere. I quoted it earlier.
Apostles in need breeches.
Pardon?
Apostles in need breeches.
Apostles in knee breeches. Good. Okay. Where was I here? Yeah, okay, number 4. Some work to enshrine a Christian nationalist interpretation of Jewish history in school curricula. Still others advocate for immigration restrictions, specifically to prevent a change to American religious and ethnic demographics. So stop all the visas for people that come from Muslim countries. Because we don't want to be overshadowed by Muslims, for heaven's sake. Some have argued that the US government must defend and enshrine its predominant Anglo-Protestant culture in order to survive, in order for our democracy to survive. Christian nationalism is dangerous for America. It tends to treat other Americans as second-class citizens. The full religious liberty of all Americans would not be respected. Morals regulation, to regulate conduct, would reduce our nation into a morality police state, like the kind we have in Iran, for the Muslim religion and other places. Okay? It is an ideology held overwhelmingly by white Americans. That's really, we should call it white Christian nationalism. Thus exacerbates racial and ethnic divisions. It is increasingly marked by fear and the belief that Christians are victims of persecution. Have any of you felt persecuted because you were a Christian? No, somebody might disagree with me and totally reject my faith. It's happened. In the university campus, he used to argue with communists, that is, American students who were leaning toward that kind of radical socialism, communism. It is increasingly marked by fear and the belief that Christians are victims of persecution. Some are beginning to argue that American Christians need to prepare to fight physically to preserve Americans' identity. I have a cousin, a niece rather, and her husband in the Middle West who believe this. And their kids. And they're in this kind of ideology. Some are beginning to argue, fight physically to preserve America's identity. An argument that played into the January 6th riot at the Capitol. When you look at the picture, there were dozens of pictures. Jesus saves, and other kind of Christian slogans to support that insurrection. So not only is Christian nationalism dangerous for the nation, for our common good and inheritance and heritage, Christian nationalism is dangerous for the church. The church's mission is to influence, to impact Americans by being salt and light. It was the images that are used in the biblical narrative all the time. Salt is that which preserves, light is that which speaks into darkness, speaking the truth, acting in love, promoting justice, welcoming the stranger, caring for the lost, the least, the less. I don't know when was the last time that you read Matthew chapter 25. A powerful statement about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And again, and we'll touch on that in 2 weeks, again and again the prophets thunder against the religious rulers of the nation. The court prophets which lauded kings that were disobeying God's commandments. And we have a lot of court prophets in our Christian establishment in the United States that validate ideologies and practices and policies that are totally, absolutely contrary to the teachings of the Christian faith. When the church depends on the state, the church ends up serving the state. I love this quote. When the church gets into bed with government, the offspring is unholy. And that's what Christian nationalism is. It's the alignment between faith and power. When the state favors Christianity, those who hold a different faith or no faith are marginalized and resent both Christians and their God. When the church embraces Christian nationalism, it produces America first Christians, not Jesus first Christians. And that's it for today.